There we go.
All right. Welcome to the show, everyone. Martin Ball is an expert on non-duality, the 5-MeO-DMT molecule, author of many books on non-duality, 5-MeO-DMT non-fiction and fiction. His recent book is Entheogenic Liberation, published 2017. He's a religious studies professor at the Southern Oregon University, Ashland, Oregon, and has time to spend with his wife, Jesselyn, and son, Jaden. He's also an avid musician and artist, and you can find more about him and his work on Martin Ball, www.martinball.net. Martin Ball, thank you very much for being on the show. How are you doing?
Doing all right.
All
It's good to
right.
be here.
So, Martin, could you tell us a little bit about what non-duality is for those viewers who aren't familiar?
Well, non-duality is the concept that's used to describe the experience of moving beyond the normal distinctions that we have of the apparent divide between self and other, between subject and object. And so non-duality means not dual. So another way of putting that would be a unitary experience or a unitive experience or an experience of oneness. And it is an experience that people can have that tends to really alter their understanding of what is the nature of the self, what is the nature of reality.
I see. So, could you tell us, our viewers, a little about how 5-MeO-DMT or psychedelics in general can help with being liberated or realize the oneness?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different aspects to that question. I mean, first would be the recognition that human beings operate from an ego, right? That we have a sense of self.
Yes.
And that in having a sense of self, we also have a sense of separation, or we have a sense of differentiation. And this is something that seems to largely distinguish human beings from most other living creatures, that we have a very solid sense of ourselves. And so we have a level of self-awareness. Now, this is not to say that, animals don't have self-awareness, because they do have a certain, at least rudimentary form of self-awareness.
All right.
But as human beings, we have a much more profound sense of self-awareness, where we're able to think about and contemplate ourselves as unique beings, as separate from everything else. In other words, we have a very strong sense of identity. And that sense of identity separates me from you, separates me from the iPad that I'm talking to you on right now. It separates me from the weather, right? It separates me from the other objects in the room. And that through this self-awareness, we, in conjunction with our memories and with our experiences, that we have like a story of ourselves, of who am I and how I came to be. And, this is something that develops, of course, quite naturally within small children. Little babies, they don't have it, right? Babies don't have an ego. They don't have a sense of themselves yet. And that's something that grows over time as children become more self-aware and understand more of a sense of themselves as who they are. And then by the time that we're adults, that our egos are pretty well formed. And our egos come with patterns of expression, patterns of thought, certain identities, and that we use our memories to, as I've said before, kind of create the story of ourselves, of who we are, what's happened to us, what's turned us into the person that we are. And that as adults, that our ego is pretty well formed, and that serves us as social beings, right? It allows us to interact with others and interact in a society. And of course, all different cultures and societies have different constructs and different assumptions about what it is that makes the self and what makes an individual, and how that individual fits within the family structure, fits within society, fits within culture. And a lot of that is we are trained, that we take up certain assumptions within whatever our given culture is about how the world works and what it means to be a human being. And we pick up things from our parents and from other significant influences within our lives. And it serves us as a social being, but at the same time, the ego also tends to trap us in the sense that um, it doesn't necessarily coincide with how we would be at a very authentic level, so that there's a contrived nature to the ego. So the ego itself is something of a character, and we are acting that character, and we also identify with that character. But what a non-dual experience does, so maybe just back up a moment. Again, from the ego, we experience reality from a dualistic perspective. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, it's just how it works, that the ego separates us out from everything else, and it creates the sense of, whoa, I'm this person over here. But in transcending that dualistic perspective, transcending the ego and opening up into a non-dual experience, what gets revealed within that is that, oh, that self that I thought that I was and that I've identified with is just a character. And that the true nature of consciousness, the true nature of being, is something that is far beyond just the narrow confines and constructs of the ego. And that in the non-dual experience, it is the identification of our deepest sense of self with this non-separated sense of consciousness. So another way to describe that would be a universal sense of consciousness. I like to use the word God, right? That for me, that seems like a fitting word for this, that this is a universal consciousness in which there are no separations, there are no distinctions. And the fact that people can experience this, I think, reveals quite a lot, meaning that it's not just an accident. It's not just some personal perception, right? That it occurs when someone moves beyond their ego and into this more universal sense of consciousness. And then, the ego comes back, excuse me.
No problem.
And then we kind of fall back into our personal identity. But once someone has had that non-dual experience, then it really raises the question of like, okay, well, I thought that I was just this person. I thought I was this ego. I thought I was this particular construct. But now that I've had an experience of being something far beyond that, that is universal, that is not separated, then that then creates this questioning nature around, well, then what is my ego? And is there a way for me to experience more of being outside of my ego? And generally, with these non-dual experiences, that the ego itself then feels very constricted. It feels very restrictive, that, okay, I've identified with a limited sense of identity. I've identified with a limited range of action and thought and expression. And I've always thought of that as me. But now it just seems as it's just the liberation as a concept is kind of opening up this question of, well, how do I live in such a way that recognizes that the majority of my experience is going to be through this dualistic filter of the separation of sense of self and other, subject and object, but living more in alignment with the reality that actually there's only one consciousness that is interacting with itself through the different guises of subject and object, self and other. So liberation then is a process of relaxing the structures in the identification of the ego itself to move someone into a state of being more authentic with themselves and with their experience. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah. So could you tell our viewers a little about how 5-MeO-DMT differs from other known psychedelics like LSD, DMT, and psilocybin?
Yeah, well, actually, I think let me return to a moment for part of the question that you asked before. I
Yeah.
don't think I actually answered it because you asked, like, well, what role do psychedelics have to play in this? And the role the psychedelics have to play in this dance between duality and non-duality, ego, liberation, is that the basic way that I like to describe what psychedelics are doing is that they tend to function as energetic amplifiers within the human system.
Okay.
In that psychedelics function as neurotransmitters within the human body. So when you ingest them, you're changing the neurotransmitter makeup. You're changing what molecules are interacting with your brain. And what they do is tend to amplify our experience of energy. And by energy, I mean all the different levels of our experience of being. So,
like perceptions?
Yeah. So what we hear is energy. Okay. What we see is energy. And I'm not trying to talk about it in some kind of fluffy new age way. I mean, I just mean that sound is vibrations, okay, impinging upon our ears. That is energy, right? These are patterned waves of energy. Things that we see, these are light waves that are being taken in by our eyes. Our emotional content internally, emotions are also energies. They are things that we feel that come in waves. Thoughts are patterns of energy. We, of course, have brain waves, right? We have alpha, beta, theta, gamma. We have all these different kinds of brain waves that, depending on our brainwave state, which is an energetic state, right? The brainwave goes up and down. That's an expression of energy, right? It has amplitude, it has frequency. So that in taking psychedelic molecules, what we're actually doing is shifting our brainwave patterns, and we're shifting the way that information is processed and related in the brain. And that in turn affects our perceptual abilities as well of both the outside world as well as our internal landscape of our thoughts and our emotions and things like that. Okay. Now, I also like to describe the ego as a collection of patterns of energy, meaning that our ego is not one particular thing. It's actually many different things that kind of, you put all these things together and it creates a sense of self. So these would be ways that we use our body, right? That in and of itself is an expression of energy. Like some people are really passive and they're not very active, so they don't move very much. And then some people are just, I'm really excited. And then when I'm in my ego, I'm just talking, whatever it is. And it includes our tone of voice, the linguistic patterns that we use. It's the thoughts that we think, the ways that we identify, the ways that we express ourselves. So when we take a psychedelic molecule, it's going to impinge upon the normal structures of our thoughts, perception, and experience. Okay. Now, in most instances, consuming psychedelics don't necessarily open one up to what I would consider a full non-dual experience, where there's this complete dissolution of the sense of self. Usually at minimum, there's an alteration in the sense of self, where our perceptions and our thoughts and our emotions are affected. And, in a therapeutic context, for example, the psychedelics, you can access, traumatic memories, you can deal with repressed or unexpressed emotions, you can gain insights into yourself or even to the nature of reality. But that's still happening at a subject-object level. That's still happening at a dualistic level. So in most instances, we could say that the consumption of psychedelics kind of loosen up the boundaries of the ego. So, for example, if you have like some kind of repressed traumatic memory, that the structures of the ego are helping to repress that. And then you've developed behavior patterns around that repressed memory in order to help you survive and help you to cope with life, or maybe not fully encounter your difficult emotions or your difficult thoughts. So you can take psychedelics and kind of loosen those boundaries, and then some of this unconscious or subconscious material can then surface, or repressed feelings could start to come out. People might have to laugh, they might have to cry, but again, it's still usually at this level of subject object differentiation, that I am experiencing this memory from my life, or I encountered a spiritual being that helped me process through my emotions or gave me knowledge or something like that. So there's still this subject object divide. And that's the case with most psychedelic experiences. So what, now to jump back into the next question, that what makes 5-MeO DMT a bit unique within the realm of psychedelic molecules is that, at least in my experience, and in the experience of many other people, that the consumption of 5-MeO DMT is more likely than other psychedelic molecules to completely override the structures of the ego, and therefore make a full non-dual experience more readily available than it is with other psychedelic molecules or other psychedelic methodologies. So, for example, someone can spend years drinking ayahuasca, and they can have lots of powerful experiences, they can have lots of transformative experiences, they can have lots of insights. But having spoken with many people who have drank ayahuasca for many, many years, it's pretty rare to actually find someone who says that they had a full non-dual experience on ayahuasca. And the same holds true for mushrooms. So, there is a scale that we could talk about, that people have mystical-like experiences. Like people can take ayahuasca or they can take mushrooms and say, wow, I'm looking at the world and I have this sense that everything is one. But see, there's still, I am looking at the world. There's still subject, object there. Versus with 5-MeO DMT, and it's certainly not an automatic result, but the possibility is for someone to completely lose their sense of personal identity, and also at the same time lose any perception of the world or any perception of anything, and enter into this state where there can be this recognition that there's only one universal consciousness, and I am that. I'm not the person that I think that I am. I actually am this universal consciousness. And so 5-MeO DMT is very effective because it is very energetically powerful, that it can really completely override these energetic structures and patterns of the ego. And what's happening at the level of brain waves is that 5-MeO DMT tends to stimulate gamma brain waves in the brain. And with gamma brain waves, there's a correlation between gamma brain waves and these non-dual experiences, where there's this sense of ultimate connection, also a sense of ultimate meaning that is beyond the subject-object divide. So it's just much more likely that someone will have one of these experiences with 5-MeO DMT than they are with many other psychedelics. With Skype, one can also hit record.
Oh, I didn't know that. I don't use it so often, but yeah.
Yeah, with Skype, at the bottom right of the page, there are 3 dots. And if you hit on those 3 dots, start recording. Just like that.
Oh, nice. All right, let's do it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things I was going to comment on was that something that's rather unique about 5-MeO DMT is that even though it is a quote-unquote psychedelic, that often it is not very visual. And I think that this is one of the reasons that it actually is more likely to produce a non-dual experience, because whenever there's something visual that's taking place, there's still fundamentally a divide between I'm the one seeing and this is what I'm seeing. So a highly visual psychedelic tends to reinforce a dualistic experience. So, for example, DMT is highly visual. And that's where, people take DMT and they talk about, well, I saw aliens, I saw spirits, I saw machine elves, I was in another dimension, I was flying through the universe, right? But there's still that talk of I was experiencing this. So even though people might say, well, I didn't know who I was or what I was doing, but I was with these aliens, that's an experience of duality. That's not a non-dual experience. And so other psychedelic molecules tend to have this more visual nature to them, whereas with 5-MeO-DMT, the visual aspect of it is not the primary feature of the experience, that it's more this feeling of infinite expansion, infinite energy, infinite consciousness, infinite awareness, infinite love, unconditional love, right? These are the feelings that arise, and there isn't anything there to see. Now, there might be really complex fractal geometries that one sees, but even there, the visual quality is very different. Like, to again compare it with DMT, things are really bright, neon, high definition, saturated colors and images, which really easily translate into beings and realms and things and objects. But the visual quality of 5-MeO-DMT tends more to be just this pure white light that maybe gets kind of rainbow refracted around the edges. So it can
Can I
present.
ask also golden, perhaps?
Yeah, golden light, white light, those tend to be the more common descriptions. But even there, it's also common for people to say that there wasn't anything to see. And so this concept of the void is also quite common with 5-MeO-DMT. But even if you do see something with 5-MeO-DMT in the non-dual experience, it's not the experience of, oh, I'm looking at something. It's more of this sensation of, this is a mirror. I'm looking at myself, that I'm seeing myself. It's not that I'm seeing something other. I'm seeing myself. And again, it's not the egoic self. It's this universal self. So it is the self observing the self in the experience of the self. So it's all very self-referential, but again, not in an egoic way. And this is one of the reasons why there's this term of non-duality, is that to really describe what it is very hard to say, because all language is based on the predication that there is subject and object. Okay, all language works dualistically. So by saying it's non-dual, it's just a way of saying, well, it's not that. It's not what we normally think of as experience. It's something that is categorically different from any kind of other experience that we might have, right? So it's not the 99.9% of everything else we experience in reality. It's this other really profound, really unique experience that is not something that you can create, that basically you can fall into it, but you can't like make it happen, because anything that you would be doing to make it happen would be the action of your ego, and your ego cannot override your ego. Your ego can only function through your ego.
I see. So how did you realize and come to accept your own nature, in short?
Well, first it was through experiencing it. That for me, I first had a full non-dual experience with my first full 5-MeO-DMT experience. This was back in early 2008. And it was just unlike any experience I'd ever had. I'd had lots of experience with psychedelics, but they were all more along these dualistic lines that I've been describing here. And I had, experienced some sense of, oh, everything's connected, right? This idea of like, oh, wow, everything's connected, so it's all part of the same thing, but still operating at a dualistic level. Whereas with my first full MEO DMT experience, it was beyond all of that. And it was just this complete immersion into infinite being and infinite consciousness. And Martin wasn't there. It was just pure awareness and recognition of the self, of this pure awareness as being the true nature of being. And then eventually returning back into my ego, I was like, whoa, what was that? That was profound. And also for me at that first experience was just this clear recognition coming back from that this was the heart of everything, that this was the experience I had been looking for my whole life, but didn't know that I had been looking for it because I hadn't had the experience. So I didn't know what it was. And also, as someone, has a PhD in religious studies, I've studied, about mystical traditions and non-dual experience. So I had something of an intellectual understanding of it. But the actual experience itself is very different than having an intellectual understanding of it, or
Yeah,
even having had, intimations of what that experience was, as, feelings of, oh, I'm connected to everything. That's not the same as the direct experience of, oh, I am everything. You see that there's a difference in the way that I would language that, saying, oh yeah, we're all connected, we're all one, we're all part of the same thing, versus, oh, that's me. I am that. I am everything. And again, that's not the ego. That's not saying everything is Martin. No, this is Martin right here. Okay? Martin is not everything. Martin is the ego that performs through this physical body, right? But the true nature of consciousness and identity is something that's far beyond what Martin is. So this started a process for me of this energetic process of reconfiguring my sense of self and my sense of being, and unwinding and disconnecting from certain aspects of my ego. And it was definitely a challenging process, but in the end, what it all came down to, with my ego kind of thrashing about and trying to make sense of everything, was I just reached a point of acceptance and said, okay, this is what reality is, and I am this, and you are that, and we all are this, that we are this one consciousness interacting with itself. And when I finally reached a point of really accepting that, then that just became what was real for me, in a sense. So it really transformed my sense of self. But it's important to note that it was a process. It's not, and I always like to distinguish that there's enlightenment experiences, non-dual experiences, experiences of liberation, but actually freeing yourself from the ego and the habitual identification of the ego, that's a process, and it's something that you engage in over time. It doesn't just happen from one experience. And it also doesn't happen just by having many experiences, because really what it's about is learning how to embody yourself as a unique individual authentically, so that you are in alignment with your authentic energetic expression. Because what happens with the ego is that we're always editing and censoring things. We're always trying to make things be how we think they should be. And that really, liberation is this process of learning how to authentically embody yourself. And that, because this universal energy, it wants to express itself through the individual vehicle in a way that is authentic and that is not constructed. And so it's about making yourself be available for that, so that you still live with an ego. It's not like your ego goes away, but it's changing your relationship to your ego rather than the strict identification with your ego to think that, well, I am that. It's the learning how to identify with it as, this is an aspect of me, but it is not me. It's a character that I'm playing, and I don't have to be limited by the character, so that I can be more available to the authentic expression of my energy as this vehicle, as this unique individual, that is an expression of this one unitary consciousness and being.
Okay. Well, another question is, why do people have bad/unpleasant trips?
Well, there's, lots of different reasons why somebody might have a bad trip. They're not prepared. They're in a context that they don't feel supported. They are not surrendering. They're not giving themselves over to the experience. They could be experiencing things that are challenging or difficult for them, and they might have resistance within them so that they don't want to experience those things, and so they fight against it. I mean, just the key for working with psychedelics in general is that you have to be willing to surrender the illusion of control. You have to be available to what arises within the experience, and you have to be willing to go through that. Again, that these are processes of energy that open up. And sometimes these processes are rather uncomfortable, and they can be really challenging at the mental, emotional level. There can be scary content for people. And that I always like to say that, at the deepest level, psychedelics can never violate your free will. So, in other words, people always have a choice that they can either relax, surrender, trust, and let go, or they can hold on, fight, try and control, suppress, and they can do that. But when all these energies are there, that becomes very uncomfortable, and that can be very disorienting. And so there's lots of reasons why somebody might have a quote unquote bad trip. And it also depends on what molecule we're talking about in terms of like what level of surrender would be required to really move through that experience. And it's always important also to emphasize the context. Like taking low doses of psychedelics and then going out and being social is one thing. But sometimes people take more than they were planning, and then they're trying to have a social engagement. It's like, I'm just tripping way too hard, and now I'm really uncomfortable, and I don't know what to do. And, also people with a kind of really maybe more pronounced mental disorders can have really difficult times on psychedelics. That it can, if somebody already has trouble distinguishing reality from their thoughts, their projections from what's really taking place, that sometimes psychedelics can exacerbate those issues for people. So there's lots of reasons why somebody might have a bad trip. And sometimes people can come out of psychedelic experiences feeling traumatized. And I think it's really important to recognize that. And that's why educating yourself about psychedelics is important before jumping into them. Making sure you're in a safe and secure setting, and really working with yourself to allow yourself to surrender, to give up your sense of control, and be willing to move through what arises. These are all very important factors. And then also even having support systems in place, like having a sitter, having a guide can be very important. They're not necessarily required, but for many people that's very helpful. And having a support system for afterwards, for being able to process through what you've experienced, having people you can talk to about it, and finding ways to embody what you've learned. That I always would like to emphasize that concept of that it's really about embodiment. It's not about just, a lot of people have sort of this abstract notion of, I want knowledge, I want downloads, I want insights, but it's really about how are you in your being? How are you in your body? How are you in your life? That for me is what's really most significant. And sometimes people need guidance and support in order to help that through. So there's a lot of different ways that people can kind of misfire when they're taking psychedelics, and there's a lot of ways that people can be supported and helped. And it's a complex topic overall.
Yeah, yeah. So another question is, what will happen when we die?
Well, you know, I can't answer this question with 100% certainty, but look, my position on the matter, and this is based on my own experience and my own contemplation of my own experience and how I understand the nature of reality at this point, is that I always go back, first of all, to the non-dual experience, or perspective, that there's only one. There's only one consciousness. And this one consciousness is everyone and everything that we experience. And that there is no fundamental separation. Now, if that's true, and I am 100% convinced that that is true, I see no reason that that is not the case. What that also means, if we really accept that proposition, as I do, it means that there's no such thing as a soul or a spirit, right? There's no, like, I do not have a soul. There's no Martin soul. There's no spirit that is animating this body, because it's this one universal consciousness. So this one consciousness is everyone and everything. And so then, most religions have some kind of concept of an afterlife or something like that. But to have an afterlife, you have to have individual souls. So my experience is that individual souls don't exist. So that means there's no afterlife. Okay?
Yeah.
There's no heaven, there's no hell, and this also means that there is no reincarnation. Okay? Because again, just to put it in really plain language, God is the only actor playing all the different characters simultaneously. Okay? So that then when this vehicle dies, that we're identifying as Martin, that's the end of the Martin character. There's no leftover. There's no residual sense of identity there that is, oh, now I'm dead. What am I going to do? I'm going to go to heaven. I'm going to go to hell. Oh, I'm being reincarnated, right? That, no, the only thing that produces the identity of Martin is the fact that there's a physical being here that houses and expresses this universal consciousness. Okay? So, death is the dissolution of the vehicle, and it's the dissolution of the individuated perspective. So that ultimately, in a sense, like, death is kind of nothing. That death is the absorption of this perspective back into the universal consciousness. But the universal consciousness is infinite and eternal. And there's no difference between infinite and eternal and nothing and no time. Okay? So that, in other words, there's not an afterlife experience. That it's the end of the ride for that particular character. But the universal consciousness didn't go anywhere. It's still here operating. It's just we no longer get the individuated perspective of that. So in other words, your physical life is all you get. Right? That you get to live your life, and then at the end of your life, there's no more individual perspective. So it's the end of your experience as an individual. But universal consciousness continues on, and that is continuing to experience itself through all the other individuals that exist and all the rest of reality. But in my opinion, there's no such thing as an afterlife. There are no souls or spirits floating around. There's no place like heaven. There's no hell. And certainly there's no individuated reincarnation or anything like that. That's so I do refer to myself as a radical non-dualist. And I use that term because, for example, aspects of Hinduism identify as non-dual, such as Advaita Vedanta. Aspects of Buddhism identify as being non-dual. But they also teach these concepts of reincarnation. And that's where I just fundamentally disagree. That I think that if you really accept the non-dual position, that the whole concept of individual personal reincarnation is just completely superfluous. That's not supported by the non-dual model, because there's no intermediary. You don't need a soul. God doesn't need to have a soul to have individuated perspectives. It just needs bodies. And once the body's gone, that perspective is gone. So that's my take on it. People are welcome to disagree with it.
So, what do you think about cannabis usage for non-duality?
Well, cannabis, in most instances, is not really going to bring someone to a full non-dual state. That, you know, with cannabis, you can kind of get into that more kind of a lower level mystical experience of this, like, oh wow, we're all connected, like it's all one. That you can open up those kinds of feelings, but cannabis doesn't tend to override the ego, for example, the way that 5-MeO-DMT does, but it alters perceptions. It alters the way that we're processing information in the brain. So it allows us to open up our perceptual experience to some degree, and it allows us to have a different experience of the self, a different experience of being. But in most instances, cannabis itself doesn't take one all the way into a non-dual experience, but it can have intimations of that. So it can be used for mystical-like experiences, but it's pretty rare that just cannabis alone would completely override the ego. But it can also depend on how you're consuming it. Like if people are doing edible cannabis, that tends to be stronger than, say, smoked cannabis. But it certainly can change your perceptions, change your experience. And it also tends to work really nicely with many more traditional psychedelic substances. It can be used to enhance psychedelic experiences and also extend psychedelic experiences. So it's a nice element to have in the mix, I think. And personally, I enjoy cannabis quite a bit. But it's much more mundane, and especially, you know, if you've had something like 5-MeO-DMT, then like cannabis just seems so tame. You know, it's like oh, this is like way down here. Like I was just like, I've experienced this infinite experience, and now cannabis is just like it's like dipping your toes in the water versus being plunged into the deep end of the ocean, right?
So, I was very curious. Could you tell us about about how to like be in the psychedelic experience? I remember in many of your talks and interviews, you talk about called the Do Nothing program and the symmetry. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. So again, this comes from my personal experience and also the work that I've done with many people, helping them move through and into a non-dual experience and process the energy of their ego. So symmetry is actually something that's really vitally important in all of this, because what arises spontaneously when someone opens up all the way into a fully infinite energetic state is that their bodies always open up with this nice bilateral symmetry. So I'll move the camera a little bit. So, you know, people go like this, oh, like their arms open up like this. There's always a nice balance between the left and right sides of the body. And so at the phenomenological level, what they're experiencing is that this energy is just opening, and this energy is just infinite, and it's just becoming and becoming and just exploding. And so their bodies reflect that, where this, like the legs and arms become conduits for this, and their legs open up and their arms open up, and they're just, oh, you know, you go into this state of oneness. But the thing is, people from the egoic perspective, they don't know that they're doing that. Okay, it's a natural, spontaneous reaction of the body. And this is where, again, this idea of embodiment, that you embody your energy so that their body shows. Like, how do you know someone's going into a fully expansive non-dual state? Because their bodies go like that. You can see it happen. Okay, then when the ego comes back, you can see that happen as well, because the people will be like this, and all of a sudden they're looking around like, whoa, what's going on? Where am I? Right? You can actually see it in their body. Now, what I've learned through all of this, just as a general rule of thumb, when working with psychedelics, which is a very energetic medium, non-dual experiences show up with bilateral symmetry in the body, and egoic dualistic experiences show up with asymmetries in the body. So for example, let's say I'm tripping and I was like, oh man, there's something over there. Whoa, that's really weird. What's going on? So you can see there's a subject-object duality, right? That I'm here, I'm looking, oh, there's something over there. Or, there's something in front of me. Oh, I don't want to look at that, so I look away. So you see these asymmetries. But again, what happens in the non-dual experience is someone is just like, and they're not really looking at anything, but they're centered and they're focused on the experience, right? And so there's this nice balance in the body. So I use this as a basic guideline that in order to help facilitate entry into a full non-dual experience and that level of expansion, you should start with having bilateral symmetry in the body. It just makes it easier. Like, for example, sometimes people want to sit cross-legged because that's a standard meditation posture.
Yeah.
But you know what happens is people can start cross-legged, but as soon as they go into the full non-dual experience, their legs flip out from underneath them and they open up. So why sit cross-legged in the first place? Okay, so keep your body symmetrical, and then as the energy expands, let yourself open into that. And then when the ego comes back, that's when people tend to break symmetry. So like especially with 5-MeO-DMT, what happens is that there's this spontaneous embodiment of the energy. So people open up and then people start moving. They do these kinds of movements with their arms and with their legs, with their body. They're totally unaware that they're doing it. They have no clue that they're doing these movements. But then you can see, like someone's doing it and all of a sudden then they're like, and they're looking at their hands, and then you can see them like suddenly realizing like, oh shit, I have hands. What are my hands doing? Right? And you can see the interference of the ego that takes place. So my guidelines are start in symmetry, because that will make it easier for you to energetically open up, because the structures of the ego almost always operate with asymmetries in the body. So you don't want to start in asymmetry. You start in symmetry, then you open up into symmetry, then you embody that energy in symmetry, and then when your ego comes back and you become aware of that, then you rest in symmetry. And that is what most easily facilitates the entry into the full expression of energy, and then also helps you become more aware of where your ego is going to try and rebuild itself as you are exiting the non-dual experience, because you will have the urge to go into asymmetries. But if you rest in symmetry, then you can observe, oh, I really want to turn and talk to this person right now because I want to engage in subject-object duality. But you remain in symmetry, you rest there. And this is also tied to the notion of, to really facilitate a non-dual experience, the goal is to do nothing, because all doing happens from the perspective of the ego. I am going to do this. Okay? So that means that you just make yourself, as best you can, a passive recipient of the experience, so that in passively receiving the experience, you simply surrender to it and allow it to happen. And this is tied to the idea that there's nothing your ego can do to make you have a non-dual experience, because everything your ego does is just the ego working on itself. And the only way to have a non-dual experience is to completely transcend the ego. So the ego cannot make a non-dual experience happen. It can set you up with the right conditions for it to happen on its own, For example, it's your ego that's going to get you to smoke 5-MeO-DMT, right? Nobody else is going to do that, right? It's going to be your ego that convinces you to do that. So it can set up the conditions, but then there's nothing your ego can do in the 5-MeO experience to make you have a non-dual experience. The only way you have the non-dual experience is by completely letting go of your ego. So this also means, for one, it means not physically doing anything. You just receive it, okay? And then your body might be very active, but that's the authentic and spontaneous embodiment of authentic energy. That's not the ego doing that. And it also means not trying to accomplish something with your experience. You know, like this one guy told me one time, it's like, oh, I want to take 5-MeO-DMT so I can commune with my dead mother. And it's like, dude, what are you doing? Like that's 100% ego. Like your mother's not there, first of all. And that you wanting to use this to do something, that's just your ego trying to impose some kind of structure and outcome on the experience. It's like your goal is do nothing and receive the experience. And it also means not trying to make sense out of it, or, you know, again, you can see people, they go into it and they have their non-dual experience, and then they come out and all of a sudden they're starting to like, whoa, I'm going to like move my energy and I'm going to do all this stuff. And that's just the ego trying to do something. And again, the goal is to get your ego out of the way so that you can learn to embody your authentic expression of energy outside of the structures of ego, and trying to manipulate the energy or do something with it or accomplish something with it or achieve something. That's always the ego. So that's the model of do nothing, be symmetrical, and stay present. And that's where you're going to be able to learn how to get the most out of the experience, and also increase the likelihood that you will have a full non-dual experience. Now, of course, the ego can be really heavily triggered because this is a huge experience. This, especially 5-MeO-DMT, it's really powerful. Egos react to it. They fight with it. They squirm. They try and get away. Some people are screaming like, stop, make it stop, help, you know. There's all kinds of ways that the ego reacts. So sometimes it takes some coaching, and it takes some practice, and it takes some learning how to trust so that your ego doesn't just react, okay? Because the ego operates both through reactions as well as intentions. And ultimately, to have the full non-dual experience, you have to neither react nor have any intentions of what you intend to do or what you are trying to do. You have to remove both of those. So it's doing nothing, receive. And then to really get the most out of it is also to stay present and working with symmetry so that the experience opens and you stay present in that. And then the ego comes back in and you stay present with that as well. That's how you learn who you truly are. Because otherwise you can just have egos here, poof, ego's gone, then ego's back, and the ego says, I don't know what just happened. Where was I? What happened in the last 15 minutes? I don't know, right? So learning how to stay present through the whole experience is something that also generally takes practice for people, because we don't have any reference for experience beyond the dualistic experience, you know, because 99.99% of all of our experience is within the realm of duality. And so the non-dual experience is very rare. And especially when we first have it, we don't have any kind of reference point for it, because there is no reference point, because there's no points. It's all everything all time. It's everything all at once. So that there's no point of reference. There's no perspective to have a reference within it.
So another question is probably the last question. Where did God come from? I mean, speaking from my own personal experiences, I was so shocked that something so beyond words could exist. And I was like, how? It just keeps asking. So I thought I'd ask you that. How?
Well, that just is ultimately the eternal mystery. I mean, the best we can say ultimately is that, fuck, God is. And God obviously is, because reality is, and I am God, and I am reality, and reality is me, and God is me, and I exist. And so this is definitely happening. You know, reality is definitely happening, and it is God. Where did God come from? God didn't come from anywhere. That God, I mean, it's just reality is. God just is. And without that, there wouldn't be anything. And even, you know, there's this sense of somehow God chose to be so that God is, and that this is what it looks like when God chooses to be. And that without that choice, there wouldn't be anything. But it just is, you know? I mean, reality and consciousness is taking place. So it is. It didn't come from anywhere. It's not going anywhere. It just is. And that's why, you know, when you have these experiences, it's just like, wow, this is it. I mean, there isn't anything beyond this. There's nothing before it. There's nothing after it. There's nothing underneath it. This is just it. This is the nature of being. And being undeniably is, because we're all here busy being right now, right? I'm being, you're being, this is it. It's all happening. So being is definitely taking place, but it doesn't come from anywhere. It's uncreated. It just is. It's this self-referential expression of energy that somehow just is. And because it is, everything else is as well. And so at best, this is like, it's just the way it is, you know? And that there's nothing we can say beyond that. It just is. And thank goodness it is, because if it weren't, then nothing would be. And so it is. So there we go, right? And even there is kind of this, really accepting that can produce a sense of peace within the ego, of like ending the conscious, you know, the continuous questions of why, because that's just the ego. The ego wants to know, like, why, how. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But there comes a point where you can just say, wow, it just is, okay? It just is. And in a sense, that's where I hit my own personal point of resolution with all of this. Because, you know, my ego is like, oh, why am I having these experiences? What is this all about? What does it mean? What's going to happen? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you know what? It just is, Martin. Just get over it. This is the nature of reality. That God is everyone and everything, including you. So just fucking get over it. Stop asking questions about it. Accept it. And then be it. You know, and that there really isn't anything else to do. And that it's kind of this great existential relief. Like, oh, wow. I can stop trying to figure it out and just enjoy what it actually is. And be as authentic within that enjoyment and expression as I can. And beyond that, you know, I can mentally masturbate all I want about why and how and when and blah, 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 you know, but none of that really matters. That's just the ego wanting to understand things. And it's not about understanding. It's about accepting. And, you know, for people who are really intellectual, like, they're not going to like that. Like, don't tell me just to accept realities. But, you know, when it comes down to it, like, look, you can choose to get yourself into a mental knot, or you can accept things as they are and experiencing things as they are. And I'll just tell you, it's a lot more pleasant. And you know it's true because you feel it. And that's all that it really can come down to there. And, you know, I can't argue this to anyone. Ultimately, I'm not going to convince anyone. But if you experience it, you'll know it. It's just like love. How do you know you love someone? Well, you feel it. You know it. It's like, look, I love you. You know, like if your lover says, prove to me how you love me. Why do you love me? Tell me the reasons. It's like, I just do, okay? I just love you. I know it because I feel it. And how do I know that God is all of reality? I just, you know, I feel it. That it's the truest feeling I've ever felt. And so for me to deny that would be to deny just the very core of what I experience as the nature of being. And that And for anyone who's experienced it for themselves, that, they can say, well, yeah, I guess that's really what it is, that this is all one being interacting with itself, and we are that, and I am that, and you are that. And okay, what do we do now? Right? Because then that's the real question. What do you do now? And ultimately it comes down to, well, then be yourself. Stop trying to make yourself be anything and be what you actually are.
See, when someone is confronted with harsh ego aggravations, what would you recommend or suggest to just do or not do about it to overcome it?
Yeah, well, here I recommend that ultimately dealing with the ego, again, is a process. And like, everybody wants like overnight change, like, oh, can I just free myself and just be done with that? But actually, it usually doesn't work that way. And it takes observation of the self, and it takes willingness to explore authentic expression and embodiment. And for a lot of people, that means just taking small steps at a time. But let's say something's really aggravating your ego. Okay. One of the first things you can do is then observe yourself. Well, how am I reacting in my body when some, and can I relax that? Okay. So there's a lot that you can do just to observe your body. So one of the things I recommend is like, okay, if you feel your ego getting aggravated and worked up about something, go into symmetry. Okay. Because that is the neutral position, right? That's the non-dual position. Go into symmetry and then observe, like, oh, but I really want to crunch up my fist because I'm so angry at that person when I'm thinking about it. It's like, oh, well, just notice how you're expending energy there. Or a lot of people fidget when they get aggravated in their ego. So, they'll sit there and they'll scratch their legs, or they'll bop their leg up and down, or, they kind of move around a lot, or maybe they blink a lot or twitch their eyes or whatever it is. So first thing is you just observe, like, where am I expressing energy? And in most instances, people can find that they're not even aware of what they're doing. So the first thing is just become aware, like, oh, every time I get agitated, I shake my leg. So then the next time you notice that you're agitated and you start shaking your leg, make the choice, don't shake that leg. And then see how that shifts your experience. So there's a lot of the physical embodiment that's very, very important, and that opens a gateway to really understanding the unconscious patterns, because it happens at the level of thought, but thought is always embodied through the body. It's embodied through our gestures, through our tone of voice, through the words that we use, by the way we inhabit our energy. That, I always like to tell people, if you really want to understand yourself, think of yourself as a being of energy. Okay? You are a being of energy. And it's not, oh, I'm just energy floating around. No, you're energy embodied through the human vehicle. Okay? But you're a being of energy. So when your ego is agitated, you're going to be engaging and expressing energy in particular ways. So first, you become aware of that. Okay? Then, so all of that is embodied. And then, of course, we have thought processes. And the ego tends to operate by holding on to the past, projecting into the future, or creating attachments of desired outcomes and desired results. And so that's also a place where you can examine yourself. Like, oh, am I telling myself stories right now? Am I projecting what I want into the situation, or am I being present with the situation as it is? And then also with our expression, that through the ego, we either express ourselves unconsciously, or we structure our expression in order to achieve particular outcomes. In other words, I'm really feeling unhappy right now, but I don't want to tell this person because I don't want to make that person feel unhappy, right? So there we can see there's these levels of, I'm projecting a certain outcome and I want to get a certain result from this person, so I'm going to edit the things that I say or the way that I express myself. Versus authentic expression is I feel it and I say it. And that allows the energy of our emotions and our experience to process through more cleanly. Whereas if we're editing or censoring ourselves, then we're going to be repressing and stuffing down energy. And if we're operating from our sets of beliefs rather than what is present within reality, then there's going to be a disjunction between what we are seeing, experiencing, and expressing and what really is. And so it's about this process of developing clarity within yourself, of learning what are the patterns that are running me, what are the patterns that I am attached to and that I identify with, and how are they limiting my authentic expression of who I actually am, what I actually feel, what I actually think. And so for a lot of people, it's this kind of slow, incremental process of becoming more and more aware of these things and then choosing authenticity, allowing ourselves to express what we're actually feeling, and also creating clarity of thought within ourselves so that we're not running ourselves from unconscious attachments and thought patterns and belief systems. And that is where, quote unquote, liberation is. Liberation is not freedom from reality, freedom from ever having an ego and living in a state of bliss all the time. Liberation is, can I authentically embody and express my energy in any given moment without being run by my ego? And that even there, people are going to fail, people are going to succeed. It's an ongoing thing because every moment presents us with an opportunity to either be authentic or to work from some level of attachment or projection. And that's an ongoing thing. Now, the more practiced you get at it, the easier it becomes, and you can really feel the difference within yourself. I'm bullshitting this person. I'm telling the truth. I'm doing what I think I should. I'm doing what feels right. And I know it's right because I feel that and I'm in alignment with that. And that, there's successes and failures along the way, but it's a process. It's a way of reorienting around who you are and how you express. And here I think the non-dual experience is really invaluable because that's the experience that lets you know, oh, wow, I'm actually an infinite being of energy, yet I experience myself from the confines of this particular individual. So how do I do that in a way that's really authentic? And that when people are asking that question, that's what's going to point them in the right direction. And it's not about do this, do this, do this, do this. It's be authentic. And you have to discover that in the moment. That's not a program, right? That is coming from a place of clarity and presence within the moment.
See. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I want to ask, anything else you want to tell our viewers before we say goodbye?
Gosh. I don't know. Yeah, no, nothing I can think of. I guess I just hope you enjoyed the conversation. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot too. So, well, thank you very much, and have a good day, Martin.
Okay, you too.
Bye.